Tonight's notes are about the fighting that takes place around the city of Boston in the time period of 1775 to 1776. Up to this point, we've talked about the buildup of British forces in Boston. We've talked about the Battle of Lexington and Concord starting off the war. So we're going to kind of pick up from there with this set of notes. So speaking of Lexington and Concord, right, the fighting happened there April 19th, 1775. Both battles are really more skirmishes than what we would think of as traditional battles. And the fighting ends with 73 British soldiers dead, about 200 wounded. The colonists lost some militiamen as well, but lost fewer than the British did. A lot of the British casualties were actually after the battle as they were marching back to Boston. The colonists lined up, behind fences, behind buildings, behind stone walls, and took shots at the British as the British marched mile after mile after mile to try to get back to Boston after they failed in their mission. The colonists were able to actually get rid of most of the weapons and hide them before the British got there, thanks to the likes of Paul Revere and William Dawes and other riders who got out there to warn the colonists to move the weapons the British were coming to take. So in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, the British controlled Boston. They're in the city, while the Minutemen controlled all of the area surrounding Boston. And day by day, more and more militiamen from other parts of Massachusetts and nearby areas are pouring in and basically trapping the British troops in the city of Boston. So there were rumors that the British, in an effort to kind of to break out and branch out a little bit, were going to seize Bunker Hill, which was some high ground across the Charles River from downtown Boston. And that overlooked the city. It's a good strategic position. So to try to prevent them from doing that, the Minutemen took over nearby Breed's Hill first. And so you can see on the map here, the red circle here is where the British come ashore to try to get rid of these Minutemen who had taken positions here at the top of the hill. So the plan was the British would line up, would march up the hill and knock these Minutemen out of their positions and take over the hill. So in June 1775, what is called the Battle of Bunker Hill took place, even though it's a misnamed battle. It actually took place on Breed's Hill. The Americans had the high ground, and the British were having to march up the hill to try to get them out of their positions. High ground is good in warfare. You want that high ground. Now, the Americans didn't have huge stores of ammunition, so they were told, hold your fire till the British get close, right? The famous line was, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. Let them get close enough that you can see the whites of their eyes and then fire. Make your shots count. The colonists twice were able to beat the British back. The British came up the hill, the colonists unloaded on them. It forced the British to retreat back down the hill. The British came up again, same thing happened. The third time up the hill, the British are actually able to force the Americans out of their positions because the Americans had run out of ammunition. After the battle was over, George Washington arrived. He had been appointed by the Continental Congress to take charge of the American forces, and he shows up on the scene. So he's not actually there for the battle itself, but he comes on the scene afterwards to take charge of all of the militia that are surrounding Boston and start turning them into an actual army. That fall, the Americans are trying to figure out ways that they can get the British out of Boston. And they sneak up on Fort Ticonderoga, which is in New York State, quite a ways from Boston, and they took over 60 large cannons. So they take these cannons from the fort. And across the winter, they drag them all the way back to Boston on ox-drawn sleds. So from the winter of 1775-76, they are marching these cannons across the frozen land in the winter back to Boston. And it takes them a while. When the cannons finally arrive in March of 1776, George Washington places them on the hills overlooking Boston. Right? So the British wake up the next day to a pretty unpleasant surprise. All of a sudden, literally overnight, these cannons are put up. And the next day they wake up, they look up, they see the cannons, and they go, now might be a good time for us to head out of town. So the only way out for them is by boat. They load up their boats, they leave, and they give up the city of Boston. So some success for the new American army in getting the British to leave Boston. To give you some sense here, Fort Ticonderoga, right? This is the fort. I mean, it really is a fort, right? And the Americans get the cannons from this fort to give you a sense of how tough this was for them, right? Here's a Google Maps showing if you were to walk from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, you're looking at about 180 miles, right? Over mountainous terrain, frozen rivers, frozen soil, snow, sleet, just pretty nasty conditions. So your response question for this set of notes, in the boxes you have on your notes, what I want you to do is draw a picture in each box that shows an important detail that you learned about what happened. One for the Battle of Bunker Hill, one for what happened at Fort Ticonderoga.